Thank you, Gary. Before I get into our study findings, I do want to thank again NACAC and David and Mike Riley and his colleagues at the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, Brad Quinn at the College Board, and Art Coleman and Terry Taylor at Education Council. Gary is right. It takes a village to get answers to some of these questions, and those groups really helped us reach the audience that we have been most interested in reaching. I also want to point out in the report itself, which I hope everyone will take a look at, we have a very esteemed research oversight committee that we pulled together and that Gary chaired to make sure that this work was objective, that it was rigorous, and that the findings were interpreted in ways that were scholarly and policy and practitioner relevant. So we're very excited about sharing with you all of the work that has gone into this over the past 15 months and the individuals involved. The purpose of the work, broadly speaking then, is to inform, contribute, and complement the work of others, as Gary said. And it really is about helping institutions broadly find a path to diversity, regardless of their consideration of race, which we absolutely stand behind as the mechanism to achieve racial diversity. But we wanted to explore what other strategies are institutions using in this evolving policy and legal landscape. And that really is the impetus of the study. We believe that effective policy, whether at the federal, state, or institutional level, is best informed by practice and by research. And that is a commitment that our Center for Policy Research and Strategy at ACE stands firmly behind. Our mission is to do thought leadership at the intersection of public policy and institutional leadership and transformation. So we'll move into the findings. I want to say that we're going to use the findings as a catalyst for conversation today. So it was really quite intentional that we present the findings and then allow the panels that will come after to reflect on the findings, but to really have even a broader conversation about diversity and equity in American higher education. So we look forward to that. Okay, without further ado, I will get into it. So I think we need perhaps to...
I can't escape.
Okay. There it is. Okay. So a little bit more about this study. We've mentioned the aims several times, but we do want to look at the legal challenges to race-conscious admissions and how they are changing and maybe have changed as well practices at selective four-year U.S. institutions. And I need to say at the outset, just to define for you what we mean by selective four-year institutions. We mean institutions that are not open access. So we're talking about institutions across a variety of selectivity levels, and you'll see more about that in a moment. We also specifically looked at nonprofit institutions and, again, four-year institutions. This study is a first of its kind, given the survey instrument, which is the first national instrument to go into the kind of depth that we do on these issues. And I want to put in front of you the study's research questions, which are very important to us to try to get into where we're going. So the first question, how have statewide legislation and Supreme Court rulings influenced student outreach, recruitment, and admissions decisions at selective, again, not open access, four-year American colleges and universities? And by legal challenges, we specifically mean statewide bans on the consideration of race. And as I said, the Fisher case in particular, we set out on this work really, as Gary mentioned, concerned about the implications of the Fisher case. We did ask about the Schuette case, but in the report, we focused specifically on Fisher. Number two, what strategies are admissions and enrollment management leaders using to support racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity, and which strategies appear to be working? And number three, how can the research policy and legal communities assist institutions in preparing for a future where the only constant seems to be change? So our survey was informed by NACAC's State of College Admission Survey, and as I said, we owe a debt of thanks to them. So moving into our participants, we surveyed admissions and enrollment management leadership. So these are the individuals that are most senior in their respective admissions or enrollment management offices, and we are quite pleased with the response, as Gary mentioned. That response yielded 338 four-year institutions enrolling more than 2.7 million students and fielding more than 3 million applications in the 2013-14 academic year, according to U.S. Department of Education data. We had 3 tracks of survey for the populations of institutions in terms of their race-conscious admissions policy. So in a nutshell, our final sample consists of 92 institutions that currently consider race, 19 that have discontinued the consideration of race, mostly due to statewide bans on this consideration, and 227 of which have never considered race in admissions. You can see here a bit more about our sample, and there is much more detail in our report, of course. But in essence, we have 153 public and 185 private institutions with a median selectivity of 64%, and that gets to Gary's point that we are interested and have surveyed across the selectivity spectrum, not just the most highly selective institutions. We have a median Pell of 33%, or the percentage of students that receive the Pell Grant, and a median underrepresented minority population of 16%. So of course, many institutions are much more diverse in these ways. Some institutions are less. For those interested in how the sample compares to the landscape of higher education institutions, and you'll see this in the report, but I know some of you will be interested, when we look at how our sample compares to the national population of four-year nonprofit selective institutions, despite having more private schools in our sample, we do have more public and less private institutions than the population, but that was intentional. Given some of the legal challenges that we've talked about and the types of schools facing those challenges. We also know that our institutional profile in terms of the consideration of race resembles the higher education landscape given comparison responses to the College Board's annual survey of colleges. So we are quite confident that this is the best information that one could have at this juncture from a very diverse landscape of higher education institutions. That leads me to a first important takeaway, and Gary mentioned this a moment ago and mentioned that our data show this, but that is that the consideration of race in admissions is not the sole domain of the most selective institutions, as the popular narrative on this topic suggests. As we would expect, race is widely used at the most selective schools. The majority, or 60% of the institutions in our study, who admit 40% or less of their undergraduate applicants consider race in the admissions process. A full third in the 41 to 60% admit rate category also consider race, 20% in the next category, and so on. So the consideration of race goes down as selectivity goes down, but it is important to emphasize that the use of race is a relevant and important policy across the selectivity spectrum. And we've specifically asked about consideration of race in admissions. That's what gets you into these buckets. It is likely that some campuses consider race in other areas, which we did not look into. So in other areas of the operation of the campus, whether they be student support services, financial aid, we did not specifically ask about. But that would lead us to believe that the consideration of race is possibly much broader than this. This is how it looks in the admissions decision itself. So a next important question after we consider what this landscape looks like is, what are institutions doing to diversify their student body, either in addition to, or as I said, instead of considering race in admissions? So in the report, we have a term that we call diversity strategies. And these are strategies used by institutions to support racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity. These are also strategies that we've partly gleaned from other sources, including the NACAC survey that I mentioned earlier, and from talking with practitioners and researchers. We offered about 20 strategies to the individuals who completed the survey. And I think you'll see that we have some very interesting and somewhat surprising things to say here given the popular narrative on this topic. So without further ado, the 5 most prominent diversity strategies, according to our sample, again, of all 338 institutions. And these are strategies used to support diversity, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic. Are articulation agreements with other institutions to create transfer pathways, targeted recruitment of racial and ethnic minorities, and that's targeted applicant recruitment, recruitment and additional consideration for community college transfer students, holistic application review, and targeted recruitment of low-income and first-generation to college students. So we see that a full 3 of these 5 top strategies are distinctly focused on outreach and recruitment. And I think we could consider a couple of the others, more broadly speaking, indirect as far as recruitment strategy. So considering these top 5, let me show you the 5 least utilized diversity strategies. Targeted financial aid for racial and ethnic minorities, reduced emphasis on SAT and ACT scores, reduced emphasis on legacy admissions, which has to do with the children of alumni or faculty, test optional admissions practices, and the use of percentage plans. So perhaps you're thinking what I'm thinking, what we were thinking, which is that trends like these highlight a major theme that we emphasize throughout the report, and that is that some of the most widely discussed diversity strategies, including those covered by the media and taken up by researchers, are in fact some of the least utilized on the ground. These bottom 4 in particular, they're controversial. We know this. They're provocative. They conjure debate over tough issues like segregation, privilege, and bias. And they should be debated and discussed and researched. But the takeaway is this. If researchers, policymakers, and the press want to align more closely with prevailing practice, and we believe that they should, then the attention of their coverage will need to shift. And we're hoping that we send that message loud and clear today. If these are the activities that take up these top 5, the largest share of an enrollment manager's time, they in fact deserve commensurate research attention and policy focus, not the least of which includes the provision of resources for institutions to carry out these activities, which are in fact resource intensive, and I think you'll hear about that on a panel later on. In an effort to contextualize our findings, in the body of the report you'll see that we bring in the personal narrative of 2 professionals that have been on the forefront of institutional efforts to increase student body diversity in different institutional settings. And you'll see them right there in the front matter of the report. They are President Santa Ono of the University of Cincinnati and Kedra Ishab, now Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and formerly the Director of Admissions at the University of Texas, Austin. And I just wanted to share with you a quote from Santa Ono, which we also have in the report. And this has to do with the connectivity to student success, something that the last panel of the day will address. So when we asked Santa Ono about the most important things that researchers and policymakers can do to help colleges and universities meet their diversity and access goals, he shared with us that we need more programs that teach children, especially those from low-income families, at an earlier stage, that college is an option for them, that there are financial aid programs to help them, and that support services are available to help them along the way. So I think this really speaks, and we put it up in front of you to break up the data a little bit, but also to show that leaders in the field are thinking about things other than the admission decision itself, which is where much of the attention is often focused. They're thinking about outreach, recruitment, student success, the wide array of diversity strategies that we're discussing today. So turning back to the data, I want to next share diversity strategies that our study participants reported as the most and least effective. So we know what they're doing, what do they find effective? And this is this particular figure for racial and ethnic diversity in particular. And I should point out that when we say effective, these are the strategies for which the admissions leaders say they have data to show their effectiveness. So that was a high bar for us to say, these are the effective strategies, these are the less effective strategies. So at the top of this list, we see targeted yield initiatives. Those are recruitment activities that encourage admitted racial and ethnic minority students to enroll. Test optional admissions practices, holistic application review again, targeted yield initiatives to encourage low-income and first-generation students to enroll, and targeted applicant recruitment for racial and ethnic minority students. A list that is heavy on outreach and recruitment again. And you'll note that holistic admissions and targeted applicant recruitment are 2 of the 5 that are both widely used and reported widely effective by admissions leaders. Perceived less effective are recruitment and additional consideration for community college transfers, articulation agreements, percentage plans, professional development for K-12 educators and guidance counselors, and reduced emphasis on legacy admissions. So considering some takeaways for a moment before I wrap up. Although about half of the colleges in our study find the transfer pipeline effective, we were hoping that this figure would be higher given the number of minority students enrolled in 2-year institutions. It may be that for this strategy and for articulation agreements, there's simply not the right policies in place, and we encourage future research to look at that pipeline effort. Test optional admissions, though not widely utilized, as you might recall from the previous slide, is perceived effective by those that employ this practice. And we do really need increased research attention here. This is not a new strategy, but it is gaining traction nationally, and it goes under-researched. In reflecting on these other 3 at the bottom, percentage plans, some may not be surprised that they are not high on the list, given the research that shows they are not in fact a silver bullet, although we also know that they can be an important tool in combination with other strategies, which we don't necessarily gauge here. We see some missed opportunity for professional development for K-12 educators and guidance counselors, particularly given President Ono's sentiment a moment ago. And perhaps we'll save for discussion this finding on reduced emphasis on legacy and admissions. And for those not familiar with the call for reducing that emphasis, some see it as a way to create will and commensurate action around access for low-income and minority students, particularly to the nation's most elite institutions, which are typically those that use this practice. But we also know that just because you reduce emphasis there may not, of course, translate to increased diversity. That has to be a much more focused effort. So I just want to reemphasize before I turn it over to Matt, and I hope you're getting this feeling, that admissions is not just about the decision-making moment. It's an important moment. There are many other moments in the broader toolbox of the admissions officer. And we don't have time to get into it today. I know this will come up later. We can't really address it in the report. You can't address institutional context, which is so salient in a survey study. So we need more qualitative work to do that. But I do want to emphasize that all of these issues are context dependent. What works for one institution may not work for another. We have to view the findings in terms of the context. And it is something that we want to dig in deeply, as I said, in a qualitative study, which is what we're going after next. So watch out. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and he's going to start in on how institutions responded to practices post the 2013 Fisher decision.
All right. Thank you, Laurel. So Laurel just got done talking about what has worked, at least in the eyes of our respondents and in their data. And what we want to shift gears to now is what has changed, specifically what has changed after the Fisher decision of 2013. And we want to start with admissions factors. Now, by admissions factors, what we're talking about is all the stuff that universities consider when they look at applications for admission. And you're going to see a laundry list of them on the left-hand side here. And now's probably a good time to note that my graphs are going to have more bars than Laurel's graphs. And it's not because I'm a psychometrician and I want to bury you in data, or because I'm from Texas and I just think more is better. It's really just because over the next few slides, what we want to do is illustrate general patterns to you. Okay, so try not to focus too much on individual factors or strategies, but observe differences across institutions and changes over time. And so don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So this is a question that we asked of all of the institutions in our sample that are currently considering race in admissions. All right? And we wanted them to indicate the relative importance of different admissions factors both before and after the Fisher decision, okay? And then we measured change. So for example, if prior to the Fisher decision, high school GPA was moderately important, and then after Fisher it was considerably important, that would be a change, that would be an increase, okay? So what we saw was a lot of these admissions factors did increase in importance after the Fisher decision, and fewer decreased in importance, all right? And when we look at the factor that was most likely to increase in importance, it's socioeconomic disadvantage, right? And that sort of makes sense. That might be one way, one race-neutral way to support socioeconomic and racial diversity on campus. And then when we look at the factors that are most likely to have decreased in importance after the Fisher decision, we see race and ethnicity and admissions tests, right? And those might make sense too, right? You might de-emphasize admissions tests as one way to support diversity. You also might de-emphasize race and ethnicity in the admissions decision if you're worried about future litigation, all right? But the bigger story here, as you look at this graph, is that very little has changed in admissions factors since the Fisher decision. So it might be tempting to read this graph, and I should note that socioeconomic disadvantage, right, that's the very top admissions factor, the one most likely to get an increased emphasis. And that only happened at about 11% of the institutions in our sample. So it might be tempting to read these results and conclude that universities have largely ignored the Fisher decision. But we would encourage you to avoid that temptation, because the Fisher decision itself didn't have anything specific to say about what you could and could not consider in admissions decisions, right? It just said that if you're going to consider race, you also have to explore other broader diversity strategies. So a better question here might be, how did diversity strategies change after the Fisher decision? And here's where we want you to observe general patterns. So keep your eye on those purple bars there. And what you can see is they get a lot bigger. So there's much more action in the area of diversity strategies. Universities were much more likely to increase their emphasis on broader diversity strategies after the Fisher decision than they were to change up their admissions calculus, okay? And when we look at the diversity strategies that were most likely to see increased emphasis, we see some familiar faces. They have to do with recruitment and yield and holistic application review, right? When we look at the ones that were least likely to see increased emphasis, also fairly familiar, right? So legacy admissions and percentage plans. So again, what's getting the most attention from researchers and the press and what's happening most often on the ground, not always the same thing, right? Now, one other point that we want to make about the Fisher decision, the concrete requirements and implications of this decision have been debated a fair amount, right? And indeed, the case is still in play. It's going to return to the Supreme Court in the next term. So in that light, it might not be all that surprising that not all that much has happened since the Fisher decision. But there might be a group of schools in our sample who look very different according to these metrics, right? And those are the schools that have discontinued the use of race. As Laurel mentioned, in our sample, it's not a huge group. We have 19 of those schools. Some of them did so by choice, but the vast majority discontinued race-conscious admissions after a statewide ban. And for these schools, we're really interested in what changed for them about their admissions factors and their broader diversity strategies. And we're going to start here with admissions factors, okay? Now, the first thing to notice about this graph is the number line on the bottom has gotten a lot wider, right? We had to expand it substantially to accommodate the fact that post-ban changes are a lot bigger, a lot more common than post-Fisher changes, okay? So when we go to the top of the list and look at the admissions factor most likely to increase in importance after a statewide ban, it is overcoming adversity or demonstrating grit. And that sort of makes sense. That might be one race-neutral way to identify students who have faced and overcome institutional barriers, okay? And then we head down to the very bottom of the list and we see the admissions factor most likely to decrease in importance after a statewide ban. and that is being the child of alumni or faculty, so legacy preferences. All right? That also might make some sense. You might de-emphasize legacy preferences if you don't want to give an admissions boost to a kid who's more likely to be wealthy and white. So from a social and economic justice perspective, that would seem like fairly good news, but I am going to throw a little bit of cold water on this narrative in the slides to come. For now, I'll just note that this reduction in legacy preferences, it only happened at 20%, about 20% of the schools where race-conscious admissions were discontinued. All right? Now, when we shift from admissions factors, right, the stuff that universities consider when they're looking at an application, to broader diversity strategies, again, we see these purple bars get bigger, right? So increases are more common. Whether the impetus was the Fisher decision or a statewide ban, universities are much more likely to change up their broader diversity strategies than they are to adjust their admissions calculus, okay? And when we look at the diversity strategies most likely to see increased emphasis after a statewide ban, you see, again, they have to do with yield and recruitment and holistic application review. There's one more diversity strategy that I wanted to call out on this list, although it might already be hitting you between the eyes, and that is targeted financial aid for racial and ethnic minorities. This was by far the diversity strategy most likely to see decreased emphasis after a statewide ban. And that illustrates an important point. Might be familiar to the people in this room and online, but less obvious to the general public. And that is statewide prohibitions on race-conscious practices in universities can affect more than just the admissions decision. All right? They can in fact make it much less likely that you'll be able to set aside financial aid for racial and ethnic minorities. So I think that that's something worth keeping in mind when we think about all of the potential consequences of prohibitions on race-conscious practices in universities. All right. But again, the larger story here is that whether you're talking about the admissions factors or the broader diversity strategies, reactions to statewide bans seem to have been more substantial than reactions to Fisher. All right. Now, it's fair to note that when we look at this slide right here, we're not talking about a huge group of schools. We're talking about 19 schools. And as Laurel mentioned, we did have a pretty big sample, right? We had a lot more schools that don't consider race in admissions, that in fact might never have considered race in admissions. And for all these schools, we were really interested in their admissions factors, their admissions priorities as well. And we had a very specific reason for asking this question. We think that these schools might offer a window into a world without race-conscious admissions, all right? And if these schools represent that one potential future, where are their priorities, right? What applicant traits do they value, okay? So what you're going to see next is the admissions factors along the y-axis, that's the left-hand side, and along the x-axis, the bottom, is the percentage of institutions that indicated placing considerable importance on each one. And I'm going to start with the top four, okay? So what you see here are pretty traditional college admissions metrics: cumulative GPA, grades in college prep courses, admissions test scores, and the rigor of the high school curriculum, all right? So the reason I've shown you just these top four is because after this, the bottom tail here really narrows a little bit. And if you're like me and you do a lot of factor analysis and you print out your scree plot and you curl up next to the fire with a bottle of wine and or a glass of wine, depending on, and your scree plot, depending on what you have going on in your personal life, and then you turn your head to the side, this looks like one of those scree plots, right? So you've got these four factors that are clearly important, and then the rest are significantly less influential. And in that bottom tail there is where you will find the non-cognitive attributes and the personal qualities like the college admissions essay, international diversity, and socioeconomic disadvantage, among others. Now, if you're wondering where socioeconomic disadvantage sits on this list, you have to look pretty far down, all right? And so why are we showing this to you? Why is this important? Well, there's an increasingly popular narrative out there that schools that do not consider race in the admissions process will instead turn to more creative, less divisive diversity strategies like extra consideration for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And we didn't necessarily see that in our data, right? Just because you don't consider race in admissions doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to give a lot of additional consideration to personal qualities like socioeconomic disadvantage. And this isn't the only place in our data that this pattern showed up, all right? So let's go back and look at these schools that do not consider race in admissions and instead ask about their broader diversity strategies, right? Things like articulation agreements and yield and recruitment. And you'll see those on the left-hand side. And again, the point here is not to look at specific diversity strategies, but rather to observe overall patterns. And ask yourself, what would this graph look like if it described the schools that do consider race in admissions? Are these schools leaning on race and therefore avoiding other broader diversity strategies? If that were the case, then these bars would shrink back towards the y-axis. And as we see here, it's actually not the case. So the schools that do consider race in admissions are also more likely to be employing other broader diversity strategies. Just put simply, race-conscious approaches and race-neutral approaches can and do coexist. So there's another increasingly popular narrative out there that suggests that you have to be either or, right? You have to either choose you're either a race-conscious institution or a race-neutral institution. You pick one and you support diversity the best way you can. And that's not really what we saw in our data, right? We did not see race-conscious approaches or race-neutral approaches being used in isolation. We saw both in concert, right? So let's take a break from graph extravaganza for a second here and wind up this section with a reflection from Kedra Ishep, who reminds us that when institutions are working to support diversity, it's about much more than doing just one thing, right? You need to be thoughtful and strategic in your approaches to outreach and recruitment and yield. A commitment to diversity is a philosophy and not an event. All right? And as institutions are working to support that diversity, we think it's really important that they understand what they can do and what they can't do. So an important question for us was where institutions are seeking guidance around the requirements and implications of the Fisher decision. All right? Now, along the y-axis, you're going to see different sources of guidance, and along the x-axis, along the bottom, you're going to see the percentage of institutions that indicated consulting each one. And we actually saw some differences here from one institution to the next, and those are worth exploring a little bit. So, first I'm going to show you bars for the institutions that said they were very familiar with the requirements and implications of the Fisher decision. These institutions were most likely to be consulting professional organizations and their general counsels, right? We all know that places like ACE and NACAC give the best advice, and so it's great to see that they're consulting those sources. When we think about the schools that were just familiar but not very familiar with the Fisher decision, you see pretty similar patterns, but a couple differences that are worth pointing out here. A little bit less likely to be consulting their general counsel, a little bit less likely to be consulting the U.S. Department of Education. And those differences are worth keeping in mind when we look at the schools that said they were only somewhat familiar with the Fisher decision. Incidentally, hardly anybody said they'd never heard of Fisher, so that's good news. But when you look at these institutions that said they were only somewhat familiar with the requirements of Fisher, you start to see more stark differences. Substantially less likely to be consulting their general counsel, peer institutions, and the U.S. Department of Education. All right. So we're not claiming causality here, right? We're not saying that they were less informed because they didn't consult these sources. Nonetheless, we think that it's critical that as Fisher continues to play out and additional cases work their way through the legal system, that institutions consult their general counsels whenever that's possible, that the U.S. Department of Education publish guidance and advertise it widely, and that networks of peer institutions be established so that institutions who are looking for information on relevant case law know where to go to find it. All right? Now, one last thing that I'll say about this graph before we move on. Across our institutions, we saw a pretty healthy reliance on media coverage. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Not all media sources are created equal. And so it's possible that these schools were getting solid information from credible sources. But this does really underscore the critical role that journalists are going to have to play in all this. And so we think it's critical that media sources accurately report on the case law that may or may not affect race-conscious admissions. Right? Now, there's one more source of information and guidance that we think should be available to universities. It's researchers. And so as we move into our last research question, I think it's good to introduce it with some reflections from both Senta Ono and Kedra Ishep. President Ono reminds us that one way researchers can help with this effort is to let institutions know whether the initiatives they're pursuing are evidence-based and whether those initiatives are helping the universities accomplish what they want to, so critical role for researchers there. And then this is a quote that I really like from Kedra. We don't struggle for a lack of information and research. Rather, it might be the translation of that research into something accessible and actionable for practitioners. And so with all of that in mind, let's move on to the last bar graph of the day. It's our last bar graph. You might see some more later in the day. But this is a question that we asked of all the institutions in our sample, right? What research and guidance are you most interested in as you continue to work to support diversity? And you'll see a list on the left-hand side here, and I just want to walk you through these really quickly. First of all, you've got the diversity effects of admissions strategies in the states where race-conscious admissions have been banned, all right? Then you have research on the educational benefits of diversity. The next one is methodological guidance on how to assess the diversity effects of alternatives to race-conscious admissions. And then finally, how to define and achieve a critical mass of diverse students, all right? So that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, you're going to see the percentage of institutions that indicated interest in each type of research and guidance. And here we actually saw some differences across sectors. And so we're going to present them to you one at a time. Let's start with the more selective public schools. They were most interested in the critical mass question. Perhaps not surprising, this issue has come up in front of the Supreme Court before, and it doesn't appear to be totally resolved yet. When you look at the more selective private institutions, they were most interested in research on the educational benefits of diversity. Clearly an important question, but it surprised us a little bit because there is a lot of research out there on the educational benefits of diversity. So, in fact, in many academic circles, the issue is considered pretty much settled. So to us, this seems like a place where academics and researchers can engage in not more original scholarship, but maybe some research to practice efforts, synthesizing key findings and communicating them effectively to key stakeholders, right? Now, when we look at the less selective schools, both public and private, you can see that they are a little bit less interested in these different types of research and guidance. Nonetheless, you have substantial numbers of schools indicating that these issues are important. And so that underscores another central finding that Laurel and I have both repeated over and over again, that across sectors and across the selectivity spectrum, issues of college access and diversity are relevant, right? And they're only going to get more important as America continues to grow more diverse and the legal landscape around race-conscious admissions continues to shift. So amidst all this change, in the middle you have admissions and enrollment management leaders who are forced to sort of just push forward, marshal finite resources, and support diversity the best way that they know how. And so we thought it would be appropriate to end this presentation with a reflection from the enrollment management leader who has probably been more in the thick of it than anyone else over the past decade, and that's Kedra Ishep. And Kedra, in my view, has been remarkably steadfast in her commitment to inclusivity at both Texas and Michigan. Diversity is not an initiative, it's who we are. The legal landscape may change how we do our work, but it will not change the work that we do. So we hope that you all have time to peruse Race, Class, and College Access. It's out Today, in the full report, you will find more stories and more analysis and many more bar graphs. So thank you so much for your attention, and I think we have some time for questions.
We do. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I would invite anyone who's here at the briefing to step to one of the two microphones here in the room so that everyone on the webcast can hear the questions. And we'll try to alternate between the room here and online. We do have a question from online, so let me go ahead and pose that. And again, if anyone in the room wants to ask a question, just line up at the microphones. We can't have more diversity in our faculty unless we have more diversity in our undergraduate and graduate admissions to build the pipeline for that diversity. An online user wonders if the panelists have thoughts on that reflection. And I might add that, in fact, NACAC conducted a study of admission offices and found that admissions offices are even less representative of the population as a whole than the student bodies at four-year institutions are. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think my thoughts, and handing it off to Laurel, and I think anyone in the audience, I know we have some admissions officers in the audience, I would actually just sort of reiterate what Kedra Iship had to say, that encouraging campus diversity and building campus diversity is a philosophy, and it's not an event, and it has to be lived from the top to the bottom. And so that includes admissions offices as well. It includes diversity within support services. It includes diversity within the faculty. And so you can't expect to gain diversity in one place and not pay attention to it in others.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that sentiment. It has to be an institutional priority from the top to the bottom, and particularly in certain fields. I mean, we don't, in this report, get into admissions practices around science, technology, engineering, and math disciplines, for example, but those are some of the fields that are the least diverse in terms of race and ethnicity and gender, and where we need to do more work on the faculty bodies. We do have scholars later in the day who will speak to those pipeline issues, I believe. Some of them, I don't know if they'll talk to it today, but are scholars on campus racial climate and other issues of climate, which also need to be addressed. It needs to be a holistic approach.
Okay, the next question. You mentioned, both of you mentioned the fact that that there is a need for research to practice. So while we're talking about this report in its most initial dissemination stages, what do you tell an admission office or an institution around which this admission and access endeavor is built? How do you start the conversation on campus about this research, and who needs to be at the table?
So I'll start. I did work in admissions for 5 years at a selective institution. Certainly, as any professional, the admissions officer is busy, and I remember this was before getting my PhD, not having a lot of time to access research or even know where to go for that work. What I think about in reflection on that time is the need for admissions officers and offices and the leadership in those offices to be very intentional about creating connections across the campus. And admissions offices and officers do that because they go out and talk about the institution and they sell it, right? And they attract students. But it needs to go not just in the way of selling the campus, but really connecting to the student support services offices, to the faculty, to the researchers on your campus. There's actually quite a bit of resources when you think of the research that an institution can do on itself in the School of Education or the School of Higher Education or the School of Public Policy. There are doctoral students out there who want to do a dissertation on your diversity, I bet you. So, I think it's really connecting to the other players on the campus. It's also having a high touch to K-12. We did see that there was that lack of effectiveness of the professional development to guidance counselors and educators, which, as I said earlier, is we think a missed opportunity. But I do encourage admissions offices to also connect with their associations. As we saw in our data, that's a powerful source of information. I put it on the researchers to do a better job of informing practitioners and really taking seriously the research to practice message, which I think we have a little ways to go still.
Yeah, I would reiterate those thoughts. I was a doctoral student in psychometrics and statistics who went to work at an admissions office to do my dissertation. So I can tell you that there are lots of research resources in these schools that you could leverage. And when I'm speaking to admissions offices or enrollment management offices, I think the questions have to be pretty straightforward. Just what is your mission? How does your admissions and enrollment management process support that mission? What applicant traits do you value? What kind of campus do you have? How do you measure those traits? And then how do you incorporate those measurements into the admissions process? And then do you have the capacity to evaluate the effectiveness of all the different things that you're doing, right? In your institutional research office, in your office of planning, budget, and analysis. If you don't, that's the point where you want to be able to call in outside researchers or researchers from the department, the School of Education, the School of Sociology, the School of Economics. They can all do these kinds of research. And you know, from there should flow the process. So it's really about, you know, when you're looking at the different race-conscious and quote-unquote race-neutral strategies that you can use, it's really about first cataloging what you want to do, what you are currently doing, and what gaps remain, and sort of what practices need to be put in place and what research needs to be done on top of that. And so once you have those key questions answered, the next steps should be pretty straightforward.
Excellent. We have a question here in the room.
Thank you very much for your work. I think it's really, really revealing as well as important. You mentioned the importance of thinking about these issues as reaching beyond the admissions decision. And you also mentioned the impact of bans on what happens to these students once they reach college. I wonder if you could comment, beyond just targeted financial aid, where else did you see changes in the kind of support that these students are receiving?
Sure. Well, I can point to one specifically. There are states that and institutions in those states who have gotten very skittish about targeted recruitment and yield efforts that could be construed as race conscious. So not just using race in the admissions decision, but also setting aside certain financial aid money, but also having recruitment activities that were designed specifically to boost the presence of underrepresented minorities on campus. Those things, by some interpretations, are affected by statewide bans, and also yield initiatives. So once the students are accepted, targeted programs to get those students to actually enroll and matriculate. If they are somewhat race conscious, then some interpretations suggest that they are affected by those bans. So that's why we say that these prohibitions on just race-conscious practices in general can affect many pieces of the enrollment management process that, if you were looking at Laurel's slides, were, in the eyes of our respondents, extremely effective at supporting diversity. So there's sort of, it's not just one thing that gets affected by these prohibitions.
I was wondering specifically about student success, their success once they reach the campus.
Yeah, so we did not get into that in our data, but the same would hold. And I've been on campuses that have been the targets of litigation for having certain types of bridge programs, for having intercession programs specifically designed to serve the minority students on that campus who, you know, these programs are in place because there is still a disconnect, there's still a gap between the success rates of minority students and low-income students and other underrepresented groups. And the campuses are right to target, if we care about completion the way that we say we do, these are the strategies that prove successful, have evidence to show. In the same way as the recruitment and outreach strategies have these evidence to show that those are very successful for attracting and enrolling. So it's very much a reality in the success space, and I think another message we want to send is that when you are breaking down or dismantling or attacking these types of policies, you're doing it, again, far beyond the decision-making moment of an admissions officer, and it's affecting the campus at large.
just like to say there haven't been
Go
any
to the mic,
statewide
Gary.
action at all on anything except for admissions. So a lot of things have been overinterpreted. There's only one Court of Appeals decision about financial aid. The Bush administration suggested to people that there were much less latitude for using any kind of race-conscious policies of any sort. The Obama administration has taken a very different view of that, and the courts have not really looked at and limited all of those other things. And one of the fundamental problems that we see very much in California, where we have 19 years of a ban now, is all of these alternatives cost money. And in the aftermath of the ban, there was a lot of money put into them in California. Most of that's gone now, and it's never reached more than a small percentage of the eligible students. So when you think about this, and you think about these charts and so forth, there are dollars and priorities to be made. Those have to be very realistic discussions in light of what we may be dealing with in just a few months down the road. In terms of research, there's tons of research, and the court has accepted the idea that there is a compelling educational interest. And there is a great deal of research. We had more than 400 researchers from 42 states sign the brief that we submitted to the court in the Fisher case. But it's very little discussed on campus. I've taught at 6 campuses. I've never had a really serious discussion in any department that I've been in of this research, even in the schools where it's done. Most people think about affirmative action as a service to disadvantaged minority populations, which of course the Supreme Court said we shouldn't even consider, only the value of diversity. But the absolute educational value of diversity isn't really discussed very often, and it's either any place on campus. And there is a real big resource there that admissions officers and college leaders need to communicate within the colleges as well as to the broader public.
And I know we have a couple more questions, but we are out of time on this panel. So hopefully the questions that have come up will be addressed throughout the day. You'll have another opportunity to ask. We are going to transition directly into our next panel. We need to get the speakers up and down. So please don't go anywhere. We do have a break at 11. So we're going to next talk about the current policy and legal landscape. So sit tight and we'll be right back.